Welcome to the World Bank Praxis Discussion Series. I'm Oscar Sabakti. I'd like to welcome our audience here in Sydney, those watching on APAC, listening online and on radio, and those in our offices in Honiara, Dili and Port Moresby. It's hard to believe, but no country has been able to achieve true gender equality, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the workforce. Globally, women still earn less than men, and that's if they're employed at all. Those who are earn up to a third less than their male colleagues, and when it comes to senior management roles, one recent survey found that only 24% of those roles are filled by women. Our region, the Pacific, has the dubious honour of having the world's lowest rate of female participation in politics, and while women are becoming better educated, they continue to lack access to land, finance, jobs and income, and unfortunately are at greater risk of falling into poverty. Promoting women's economic empowerment as entrepreneurs, employees and leaders is increasingly seen as one of the most important driving forces in addressing this inequality. But how can this be achieved? What works to address gender gaps in the workplace? What part do businesses, communities and ordinary people have to play in addressing this inequality? Well, to discuss these issues and more, we're lucky enough to be joined today by Amy Luinstra, Senior Gender Specialist at the International Finance Corporation, Amanda Donigi, founder of Stella Magazine in Papua New Guinea, and Joanne Crawford, Research and Policy Advisor at the International Women's Development Agency. Thank you all for joining us. Firstly, we've painted a rather grim image of women's participation in the workforce. Why is this a concern? Why should it be a concern?
Well, I mean, there's so many reasons that it is disconcerting to see such low participation, and as you said, even dropping participation in some regions. While I don't think there's dropping participation in the Pacific necessarily, it's still exceptionally low. And that's a concern across the board for everything we care about in development. It's a concern for economic growth. We know that growth is up to 18% slower in these regions because of low economic participation of women, but it's also for individual companies. They can't access, retain, or train and develop the human resources they need in order to grow and create more jobs. So it's very clear that just from an economic perspective, macro or micro, it's a big problem. And that's not even talking about the social and human development impact, because we know that women, when they have access to income, they're more likely to spend it on their families. So there's a number of reasons. I'll leave a few more for the colleagues here to answer.
Amanda?
Well, my work in media, I think it's very important for women's voice to be in media and for role models to be appearing in media as well for young women. So I think that they're not appearing is a concern for the development and how that's going to increase. So yeah, definitely a concern for the media as well.
And Joe?
Yeah, I mean, we sound like we're part of the same chorus. There are both rights and instrumental reasons. So it matters because women are half the population and they want to be working as part of, I mean, I think for all of us, work is a really important part of how we express ourselves. And so for individual women, the right to be able to work and to participate is part of what it is to be able to lead a full, productive life. I think in terms of for companies, you know, the lost potential that is there if you're not able to draw on the talent, or for that matter, women are in many economies important consumers, important stakeholders in companies. So to not be able to be accessing that portion of the community, I think, is a loss and a limit for those companies. So practical, instrumental reasons and really strong individual rights reasons, I think.
Amy, the recent World Bank Women in Work report has found that women in full-time employment has actually fallen since 1990 from 57% to 55% in 2012. Why is this happening? You would think it would be the opposite, wouldn't you?
It's quite a conundrum, and actually the World Bank report didn't have an answer to that specific question, but it did discuss a variety of the constraints that women face in employment. And what's interesting is that this is something that absolutely cuts across developing and developed countries, where you have women who continue to struggle with balancing their non-economic activities and all the responsibilities that they have at home and work. And so it's something you see in Papua New Guinea as much as you see in Australia and the United States. So I think that's a big constraint. There's education and skills gaps that are part of it still. There are mobility issues, and in some places in the world, in fact, in all places, it's to some extent an issue. Violence against women that limits their abilities to work. But just a huge number, and the combination of things, I think, is what that study and many others have shown, that it's really a network of constraints and challenges that often lead women, even if they enter the workforce for a while, to drop out once they have children.
And Joanne, you touched on briefly the fact that this issue just doesn't affect a household situation, but it has broader effects on the economy. Can you explain that?
In terms of women's lack of
participation,
limits on women's participation. Look, I mean, the costs happen in a range of ways, and I think Amy talked about the constraint of care, and I think that really, from where International Women's Development Agency sits and the work that we see in communities, is that the whole question of unpaid care is a really binding constraint. And it doesn't just affect individual women and families, but it affects economies, because what it means is when women are bearing a disproportionate responsibility for that unpaid care and household work, what it means is they often then don't have the mobility to be able to seek out better paying jobs elsewhere, or they're locked into working part-time, which often is work that is less well remunerated than full-time work. And so what that means is that because we're not able to find ways of sharing the care more equally across the different bits of families and the private sector and the state, because those costs sit with women, they are the ones then who are, if they were able to work full-time, would be earning more, bringing more money in for their families, that would be benefiting the community, and there would be a multiplier effect across the economy. So if we were to arrange, I think, unpaid care in a more equal way across society, then we would see the benefits from the household level up into the national economy.
So this is the issue of the recognition of the informal sector versus the formal sector as well.
Look, I think that's a really important issue you've raised in the context of the Pacific. So this project IWDA has been involved in. We've tried to think about the economy as like a floating coconut. So an iceberg's not really very culturally appropriate in the Pacific region. But a coconut, if you think above the waterline, you've got the formal sector. Below the waterline, you've got all that really important social and economic work that happens to keep communities going, including the subsistence work, the care work for elders, for children that are about reproducing the next generation, the market-based work, the small-scale selling that goes on. But that's invisible. So I think recognising that improving women's economic situation is not just getting them into this small formal sector, which on all the evidence, particularly the work that the World Bank has been doing in this area, the formal sector is going to remain small because of problems of geography and size of markets in the Pacific. It will remain small going forward. But the subsistence economy, there are real opportunities there, I think, to enable women to earn more for their labour, to put that into their families and into the communities, and the virtuous sort of cycle that produces. So I think we shouldn't just be looking above the waterline at the formal economy, the informal economy, and improving productivity, freeing up some of women's time. Often the work that they do in that subsistence economy is very time demanding and intense, leaving very little room left for other things in women's lives. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Amy, how do we go about recognising this informal economy, which by the sounds of it is actually quite substantial in terms of what a woman does? And it's an idea that actually Western society societies grapple with as well, recognising home duties as opposed to a formal full-time job. Is there a way that we can actually recognise it?
I mean, certainly there are lots of methodologies, and there's been lots of development of this as a field and how to count women's unpaid work, or men's unpaid work for that matter, in the home in national accounts, and that's important. But another really important thing is looking for ways to change it and looking for ways to share that work at home, and also acknowledging that women are doing economic work. We just completed a study in Papua New Guinea on cocoa, coffee, and fresh produce farmers that found that women are doing as much work in these cash crops as men in the fields, or more, but they're doing 100% of everything else that happens in the household. They're doing all the water fetching, all of the cooking, all of the childcare, all of the community engagement and church work, which is a lot in these societies. I shouldn't say all, because that's probably an exaggeration, but a huge amount. So it's also looking not just at counting what they're doing, but sharing it, and what are the interventions that help to push more equitable intra-household kind of dynamics.
Amanda, what about your experience as a young PNG woman, also a young businesswoman in PNG? Are you finding this to be a struggle as well, juggling not only your business, but also your private and personal life as well?
I don't have a private life, a personal life. It's all about Stella at the moment. But yeah, certainly I've seen it with friends that that have children and looking after the families as well as going to work. But I think what we're talking about today is attitudes as well, and how we approach it as on a human level too, and what attitudes we're teaching our sons and our daughters as well, in terms of how we're treating each other more equally, in going into this is the 21st century, and we can learn from all of the things that have gone wrong, and talking about it as Papua New Guineans, thinking about our own attitudes to life as well.
Joanne, there's a common perception that when women become more economically empowered, they're more independent and have more control of their lives. But you've actually found that there's an opposite effect as well, haven't you?
I want to start by saying that the first statement you made is true. So in a lot of the work that we've done in Melanesia, where we know that families are facing increased needs for cash income. So even in subsistence economies, they need money for school fees, they have rising ambitions, and they need money for consumption goods or for social obligations. So having an independent income stream for women is very important. They tell us it's very important. It's something that they feel that they're able to control, and it gives them some options to focus resources on things that they think are important, regardless of what anybody else is doing in the family. But that ready, automatic assumption that says women have increased income and therefore they're able to act in ways that act differently, I think we can't assume that's the case. There's a difference between women having earning income and being able to control income, and that goes to the whole question of women's ability to make decisions about the resources that they earn. And at least from the work that we're seeing in Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, one of the really big limitations that are facing many women is the question of coercion, financial manipulation and violence about increased income in the hands of women. So I think we really need to be very careful about a sort of an easy assumption that women simply being able to earn more income is an unalloyed good. It is a real positive, but it can also expose women to increased risk of violence. And so IWDA, along with the Australian National University, is just going into the field next week on some research. There is no evidence that's been collected in a systematic way about the relationship between women's increased control over resources and what it means for them in terms of the risk of violence. We know that violence is very high in the Pacific. Around about 64%, I think, of all women in the Solomon Islands over their lifetime have experienced violence. So we need to be thinking about and looking for an understanding from women in different locations, from community level market sellers through to professional women who are working in the Australian embassies, for example. We know the background levels of violence are high. We need to think about whether earning income and understand whether it's helping things, as you say, or whether it's increasing the risk. And if it is, what do we do about that? How do we act in ways that doesn't increase the harm and the risk to women, but enables them to increase their economic independence, contribute to their family, use their skills and their abilities and benefit our economies?
Amy, in your work, are you finding this effect as well, where as women become more economically engaged, they're actually encountering or more vulnerable to violence or control?
Well, we know of it. We know it happens, and one of the things that we're really trying to do is bring the private sector together to look for ways to address this issue. Because in Papua New Guinea, for example, where we've just started this business coalition for women, it was done because businesses came to us and said, we have all of this talent pipeline that looks fantastic when they're here. Our best supervisors tend to be women, but we can't progress them through a leadership pipeline here at our company because it requires maybe that they go out and manage a field site, and there's no way we can guarantee their safety and security, or because we're afraid that when we promote them, they're at a higher risk of violence. So the extent to which it happens, we don't know nearly enough about. It's great to hear that Joanne is going to tackle this major gap and really important research that's needed. But we need to find practical solutions. So that's what we're doing in Papua New Guinea. We'll have by the end of this year, I think 70 businesses together with us in this business coalition that's looking for policies, practices, approaches, and practical solutions to making sure that we can have women succeed in the workplace and stay there.
Let's talk more about your coalition in a moment, because it's a very interesting concept that just doesn't involve women but men as well. But Amanda, I'd like to ask you about this issue of violence against women in PNG, because it's consistently raised as an issue. I'm wondering, is this something that your magazine, Stella, looks to tackle?
To be honest, we try to stay away from violence against women. I feel that it gets a lot of media time. It gets a lot of airtime in mainstream media. And what we're trying to do with Stella, and I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the magazine, I'll just hold it up for you. It's an independent publication. It's all about positive stories for the Pacific Islands. So domestic violence doesn't really fit in with that. We do try to, raise topics that sort of might brush up against domestic violence, but it's not the focus of any of our articles necessarily. So there might be someone. We had Victoria Pierre-Carl, one of our writers, tell a story about her mother who had died of cancer when Victoria was 14. And she was ostracised from society. People were blaming sorcery. There was a lot of violence from her second partner and all that kind of thing. And that's the reality, but it's not something that, it wasn't the point of her article, but it was just something that came out of the article as well. So we're not trying to, flog that horse, but we are trying to sort of change attitudes by telling positive stories and sharing the achievements and positive things that are happening in the region. It's not just Papua New Guinea, but also Fiji, Solomon Islands, all across Vanuatu. There's a lot of inspiring women doing fantastic things, and they're not getting much recognition for it. And I think if we start talking about it more, it will actually lift people's attitudes as well towards women, have a bit more respect for women as equals in society.
I think what Amanda says is really vital to recognise that essentially violence is about an issue of power, and to the extent that the magazine is presenting women doing an amazing range of interesting things and challenging showing women status in a different kind of way.
And the great thing is a lot of men are buying the magazine too. It's not just for women, and it's not just about women.
That's what I wanted to ask, because I noticed you're not just profiling women in a positive way, but men feature in it as well. So what role do you think men play?
Definitely, there's a lot of young men doing fantastic things in their communities too, as peacemakers or as educators or things like that. And they're not necessarily being, aggressive and violent and the macho male that most people will think about when you think about a Pacific Islands man. So we're trying to sort of encourage that kind of attitude as well. So it's celebrating those attitudes in life rather than the strong, violent warrior kind of culture. Yeah.
And when we talk about this issue, I mean, we put the blame squarely on local PNG men, but it's interesting because when we were talking, you actually mentioned another culprit in this perception of women as well. Can you tell us about that?
I think something that doesn't get said is that we have Papua New Guinean women are challenged by Papua New Guinean men, but if you look at a business in Papua New Guinea, there's a lot of Australian men or expatriate men running these businesses as well, and they're part of the problem too sometimes. They're stereotyping women in particular ways, and they're, you know, creating another obstacle for us to be, you know, promoted and things like that too. And yeah, so there's a gender issue, but there's always a race issue as well. And that's, it's in Papua New Guinea. I'm pretty sure it's in other Pacific nations as well, where the private sector is pretty much run by expatriate run companies. Yeah.
Amy, Amanda's example would be the exception to the rule in terms of women leading businesses and enterprises. But how can we get more of this? How can we see more of this? Is the IFC doing anything to help make that a reality?
Absolutely. So IFC advisory services and even investments are looking at how to grow the private sector in a way that's inclusive and that promotes good job creation. And that means including women in it all. So we help create networks of businesses. We help with public-private dialogue. We help with the regulations that make it easier to start and grow businesses, for sure. We also want all of these initiatives to be inclusive of women. We're helping business registries in all the Pacific Islands develop in a way that also notes which are women-owned. We've helped develop networks of women-owned businesses. And then we have this business coalition for women, which is not an organization of women-owned businesses. There are plenty and they're good and important. This is about businesses coming together because they see a threat to their business in the gender inequality that exists. So we've got a lot of things that we're trying to do. Another important initiative and big focus of IFC globally and in this region is financial inclusion. And that always includes a component about targeting women, making sure they have access to bank accounts, mobile phones, and mobile banking is a big focus. We hope to reach 100,000 women in the Pacific in the coming 3 years with mobile banking services, working with all 3 of the big banks, Bank South Pacific, ANZ, and Westpac. So we're excited about those initiatives and think that they can make a real difference.
So this business coalition that you mentioned, made up of businesses with men and women, what's the ultimate aim? I mean, what does your coalition hope to achieve?
So it's really about putting out there that gender inequality is a business issue as well, and we want to be a positive driver of change for women because it's the right thing to do and because it actually helps us grow our businesses. And so there's a number of areas where we're working. We are focusing on the violence issue because it's impossible not to. So we have a working group looking at what are good policies and practices for workplaces in addressing violence. There's a second working group that's focused on gender-smart policies and practices in general. So this might be safe transportation, childcare issues, flexible working hours, etc. A third focus is on mentoring and leadership development for women, and a final one is on opportunities for women and women-owned businesses in supply chains.
Very quickly now, before we head on to some questions, we've got a lot coming in. Can I just get a final thought from each of you in terms of this issue? I mean, we could talk about it for hours, obviously, but what would you like to see, or what do you see as a solution to helping more women become empowered in the workplace or entering the workplace at all? Can I start with you, Joanne?
Look, I think a foundational issue really is better sharing of unpaid care. I think across the developed and developing world, probably many of the people in our audience today experience it directly themselves. Finding some better ways to share across the private sector, across families, men and women, and the community level. If we can find better ways of sharing unpaid care, I think what we'll find is that women are more readily able to take on different kinds of jobs and better paid jobs.
I think education is definitely a key factor here. When a woman is educated, when she's confident in who she is, when men are confident in who they are, then we can be treated equally. We can consider ourselves as equals in society, you know, contributing towards a bigger goal rather than competing with each other or being jealous of each other or anything like that. So education, I think, is going to be very important.
And I think let's also not forget those who are hiring women and making sure that they know how to do it in a non-discriminatory way, that they're able to promote family-friendly policies that allow women to stay in the workforce, and that they offer an opportunity to define this workplace as a safe space and just a model of different gender relations, of equality. And I think that can be a very powerful driver of change.
Thanks, Amy. And as I mentioned, we've got questions now. So if our audience in Sydney, if you think of any questions, please feel free to ask them. But before we head to you guys. I've got a question here from Ariana Almeida from local NGO Empresa Diac in Timor-Leste. This is open to the whole panel. Can you share your experience of working with women that have experienced situations of abuse and the roles, either positive or negative, of economic empowerment in each of these?
I think if you look at the fact that the lifetime prevalence of violence in our region is 64% in Solomon Islands, up to 100% in parts of Papua New Guinea, what you're probably talking about is many of the women that most of our programs deal with all the time. And I think one of the things that, there's never a single bullet on these things, but one of the things that we've found is really powerful for women is safe spaces for women to be together and to build their confidence and their skills in relation to whether it is financial management and savings or in relation to practicing leadership skills. For women who've been subject to abuse, it has a devastating impact on their self-confidence and their esteem. It is the ultimate power exercise. And we need to recognise that providing safe spaces for women to recognise their worth as individuals and to rebuild self-confidence, often that needs to happen with other women, including women who have experienced violence. I think often for women, and I include this in Timor where it's relatively recent that there has been legislation against domestic violence, women think that that is their lot. They think that violence is normal because it is normalised in their world around them. And so a very important step is simply saying there are laws against this and this is not okay, and actually starting to change and to shift the community attitudes about the acceptance of violence at the same time as enabling women to themselves share their experiences and start to rebuild their sense of self. I think those two things together are among the most important steps we can take.
I don't really go out and look for stories, but they always come to me. So I've spoken to women who've been abused. There's all sorts of different kinds of abuse too. It's not just between domestic partners. It's also women that are abused by their husband's family, the mothers and their sister-in-laws and things like that too. So there's a bit of a power play there going when the woman comes into the home and there's some instability and all that kind of thing. So it's not just men versus women. There's a lot of violence, full stop. And I think we need to look at this holistically too, not just through the microscope. I think economic empowerment is good, but I've heard stories too of women who are working in the workforce and they've been attacked in the office. And that's horrible. Like, there's people that they work with. So there's all sorts of terrible things going on. And, choosing a good partner, like having the confidence to choose the partner in your life so you're going to have a peaceful home life, doesn't necessarily mean that something's not going to happen to you at this stage, unfortunately. So it is a big issue that we need to tackle, but I think definitely attitudes towards women need to change, and it's mothers who are teaching their sons. This is our responsibility as women to teach our sons how to treat women with more respect.
I'm not on the front lines of that kind of service delivery, and I'm not really dealing with survivors of violence on a day-to-day basis directly. But there's a couple of things that I think are important. I mean, one, as has been said, economic empowerment is not a silver bullet, and it can sometimes increase risk, but it is almost always a necessary condition for a woman getting to a safe space and getting into a place where she can have better opportunities going forward. So it is really important. And second, I don't think we're talking enough about services for perpetrators who want to change. And that, I think that's a hole, and I think that needs to be addressed. And that this is men and women who are perpetrators of violence who have said it's all they've seen their whole lives. They'd like to change. They need some resources too, and we need to support that, I think.
I think the Partners for Prevention work
Yes.
study that came out, around 10,000 men across Asia and the Pacific region, really showed that for many men who are violent, particularly those who commit violence as a young person, they've experienced violence directly themselves in their home against them. So men who are victims of violence and men who are growing up in conflict or post-conflict contexts are more likely to be violent. And so we need to be really recognising and addressing this, I think, quite holistically.
Okay, do we have a question in Sydney?
I'm Dr. Elizabeth Hill from the University of Sydney and co-convener of the Australian Work and Family Policy Roundtable. So thanks for your contributions. I have a question. You've spoken very much at the level of individual women. I'm just wondering if you could comment on the state of the women's movement in the Pacific, and are there all women's unions that have developed particularly to respond to and support the needs of informal sector workers? Are they institutions that are emerging and providing these safe places and places where women can gather the skills that they need to participate with more freedom and agency?
I think one of the things that can happen when you've got very little space for your voice to be heard is that sometimes you can see competition between women's organisations, and in some parts of the region you see that in other areas, for example in Fiji, the Women's Forum that's been developed since 2012, bringing together 4 women's organisations in Fiji from really quite conservative organisations to the Fiji Women's Rights Movement, for example, is really providing a way of women coming together to act collectively in a really quite challenging political environment. So I think we see both things. I think we see some areas where the general space for women's voice is constrained, and so you can sometimes get competition for voice to be heard. At the same time, we can also see where there are organisations like the Women's Forum in Fiji doing really fabulous things, as well as in the business space of women's organisations coming together to act collectively. In terms of the workplace conditions, I myself haven't and am not aware of organisations that are working quite with the same strength of focus as you see in parts of East Asia, for example, where IWDA is working with Women's Information Centre, for example, in Cambodia, working with garment workers to enable women's voice in the trade union movement and to advocate to policymakers. So we're not seeing as much of that in the Pacific, I think in part because you've got a much smaller private sector and you've got women less directly engaged in the private sector workforce. But that's not to say we're not seeing women coming together to act collectively, and I think all of the evidence is, whether it's in a workplace environment or whether it's at community level, that women's collective support for each other is really an important part of widening the space for women's voice to be heard and for them to be able to contribute.
Amy, we have a question here from Moete Garcia from the Population Services International in PNG. What groups of women does the Business Coalition target, and is there any support through the network that could help women at the grassroots level?
So it doesn't target women. The Business Coalition for Women it targets businesses. It targets businesses that, whatever their ownership structure, wherever they are, if they're in traditional fields for women to be employed or non-traditional fields for women, it works with businesses. So we have everything from oil, gas, and mining companies to banks to small educational organizations, and pretty good geographical spread as well across the country. But it's mostly been looking to date. I say to date being March, 3 months, a couple months ago. It's been looking at the formal sector, those formally employed, and a little bit, they tend to be medium-sized companies, not necessarily very small, although we have some members that are quite small. I think there's an opportunity is around the work that we're doing for supply chains and looking into a few key supply chains and what opportunities might there be for women-owned businesses in those supply chains. But that's mainly been our focus to date.
Okay, excellent. Another question in Sydney.
My name is Vij Nagarajan and I'm with the Asian Development Bank, gender consultant. Thank you so much. It was so interesting to hear the way you brought together human rights argument and the economic rights argument, and also asking us to give it a positive shift and look at the generations ahead. I really enjoyed it. So my question is to do with the accountability discourse that's been getting quite a lot of airplay lately. And the question is, as we move towards economic empowerment, do we use the same kind of techniques of accountability and reporting that's used by the private sector to report also on gender and the way in which gender moves forward and success of programs? It also, I suppose, relates to replication and scalability of programs. So the question is just about how you actually monitor and report on success?
I think accountability is vital, and I think one of the reasons why progress on gender equality has been slower than otherwise might be is that we have commitments to gender equality that hang free-floating from implementation, and the ability to actually track in a systematic way the integration of commitments and see how they translate into policies and programs and resourcing and spending, and then monitoring at the end. I think the fact that we have not had that continuous process is one of the reasons why I'm not saying people are venal at all, but they're always competing demands for resources, and if you've got commitments that are not then implemented in a structured way and built into the scaffolding of organisations and the way they work, you know, you get evaporation, things disappear, policies don't get implemented, there's a lag. So I think accountability for commitments and to commitments for organisations of all kinds, governments, NGOs, are critical. I think tracking the dollars are really important. If it matters, you want to be measuring it, you want to be looking at and resourcing it. So for a long time I think we've had gender equality work, and particularly dealing with really intractable challenges of violence against women, really being deeply under-resourced compared to their significance as a security problem, as a human rights violation. So for me, accountability for the actions of policymakers of all kinds is vital, but in a way that that is public, that speaks to the rest of us as citizens and as communities that have a stake in this. If governments are saying they're going to do these things, well, show us, tell us how the dollars go. So things like gender budget mechanisms that say, we said we were going to spend this much, this is how much we spend, that starts to tell you the story of whether what governments and other organisations say is going to happen actually does happen. So I think accountability is critical. I think measuring success, determining what success looks like and then measuring it really in a really systematic way is vital. You know, it's what gets measured matters, and you can't know whether you're doing the right thing but you're just not doing enough of it, or whether you should be doing something different if you're really not tracking the impact of the work that you're doing over time. And yeah, that's enough from me. I think it's really important, Viv.
How do you guys measure progress or measure inaction or action?
Right.
I would suspect that you would have a set amount of instruments.
Well, I hope, move in that direction. It's new, but that actually is exactly the discussion we're having Tuesday morning, 7 a.m. at the board meeting of the Business Coalition for Women, is what does it mean to be a member and what kind of accountability do you have? I mean, the rules of our association set out what a member of in good standing is, just in terms of broad principles. But how we go about building accountability mechanisms is yet to be decided. It's an important discussion and we're having it. I don't know that the private sector has been that much more successful in showing its accountability, particularly on gender issues. So we have good standards for how to report on environmental issues and other social issues, but I don't think gender has been as significantly treated in those global certification or other kind of CSR-related initiatives.
Can I ask Amanda a question? Because you're, I guess, in the unique position where you are a business owner in Papua New Guinea, as well as being a woman. How do you, in your workplace, ensure that there is this accountability or there is this balance between men and women? I mean, is it even an issue? And do you factor that in when you're engaging, say, writers or photographers or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the magazine is drawing people to it that sort of have the same attitudes. That we have a sort of a collective idea of what we want the world to look like and what we want Papua New Guinea to, and the Pacific Islands, how we want the life to go forward. Things are happening, and it's really important that we're telling these stories, because in mainstream media it's just doom and gloom, rape, domestic violence, sorcery, you know, burning women in the mountains of Papua New Guinea. That's all. I mean, it's very important that we tell that story because it's horrific, but at the same time we need to be making sure that there's a balance of stories as well. And the people that are sending in the stories, you know, they're already interested in the magazine. They have the same attitude to us, so we don't I don't think that any of our male contributors are domestic violence perpetrators or anything like that. But yeah, there's a lot of respect for women from men. It's growing, and we're hoping to just showcase that.
I've got a question here about political will. Is there enough of it in order to change this, but also will from society as well? Because obviously there's a top-down approach, but it's also got to come from the bottom up as well. Is there enough of that?
Can I answer? We've got three members in three females in politics in Papua New Guinea since the 2012 elections.
Out of how many?
Out of 50 or so. No, 22. But then there's the governors as well, so 40, right. 44. But there's it's a very small number. It's the most we've probably ever had since our independence in '75. But the things aren't really changing, and what I see is that the female politicians are not necessarily putting their hand out and trying to pull anyone else up with them. They're just, they've got a very I don't know if politics just makes people very individualistic or yeah. So the idea is that we get more women in politics and we'll pull each other into the fold, but it's not really happening.
I guess it's part of this cultural change, and it sounds like through your magazine you're aiming to change that culture by a positive portrayal of women, but also men who are helping that as well.
Yeah, but there's not a lot of women that really want to make change on the ground are not interested in politics because they don't see it as a way for change to happen either.
No.
It's
the same in Australia as well, isn't it?
Well, I think, how part of it is changing what you imagine a leader to be, I think, because if all you've ever seen in Papua New Guinea is a particular kind of male leader, and you don't see yourself as being like that, why would you see politics as being a business for you, I think. So IWDA is working with a large number of women's organisations in the region around a multi-year leadership program for women that is really about supporting individual women, women's organisations and women's abilities to act together collectively. And if I'd had my wits about me, Elizabeth, I would have said that more directly before. Really trying to recognise that to get more women into politics, it's in part about changing the ideas of what we think a leader is, women's own ideas, but also the broader community's ideas, enabling people to act politically and engage politically from the levels where they are at community level, and creating pathways from there through local government and up into national politics and regional politics. So we're seeing some really interesting women putting themselves forward for election and making those calculations about whether to stand. We've got a number of elections in the region this year, Solomon Islands, hopefully in Fiji. So I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens this year and to see how we're starting to see the change. But women are acting and being engaged around change. They're not always going into big P politics to create that change, but they are working in different kinds of ways at community level. And it's just had 2 days at a conference at the ANU where you could really see the generational change. You could see these amazing young women and men, scholars and people doing work at community level and leading in different kinds of ways. The fact that we don't always acknowledge it as leadership doesn't mean it's not happening. And that's where I think Stella's doing such fabulous work, really just, doing that storytelling.
Okay, we've got a question for Amy here from Honiara. A major challenge in Solomon Islands is not enough civic education and information about these issues reaching the rural areas. It's an issue of not knowing. Is this an issue in other Pacific countries like PNG, and what would organisations like the Business Coalition do to address this lack of knowledge in rural areas?
If we're talking about more lack of general education and just literacy and numeracy and things like that, I don't know whether that's something a business coalition will pick up, but I know it's something that many of the banks that are active in the, that have branches in all the Pacific Islands are very interested in terms of promoting financial literacy. In the agribusiness supply chains that we see across the region in coffee and in cocoa and palm oil and things, I mean, there are some efforts around financial literacy. I think there needs to be more efforts around literacy in general. Clearly that's true, and I don't think we've figured out what the role of the private sector is in that in the Pacific so well, but I do know that there's efforts leading in that direction. But fundamentally, education is a public responsibility, and we need to get better education.
Amanda, is this a problem, the lack of knowledge? Is it a problem to this issue of women becoming more engaged economically? And what can your magazine do to address that?
Yes, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of obstacles. Are you talking about starting a business?
The questioner in Honiara was talking about those in rural areas, because it's one thing, I guess, for those in cities to be empowered. But, you know, obviously those in rural areas need this knowledge as well. So how can this be addressed?
Well, it starts from school, definitely. In rural communities in Papua New Guinea, children aren't going to school perhaps because they're going to collect cocoa, or they're going to collect coconuts to, you know, help the family out with. They can't even afford their own school fees, and you know, there's electrification problems. They can't do their homework. There's you know, sanitary problems. People are getting sick all the time. So education is inhibited by so many different factors in rural areas of the Pacific Islands. So getting that, you know, the good foundation of education, so that you can start, you know, you want to find out more about getting involved in civil society as well.
Excellent. We've got another question here from Honiara, open to the panel. How do I know, I'm speaking on behalf of the woman questioner, how do I know as a woman that I'm economically empowered? I guess it's interesting because we've realised that this word empowered can also mean you're disempowered in other ways. So how does a woman know that they are empowered? Joe, if you could address that.
That's a philosophical question in some senses. I mean, I think we need to value, an economically empowered woman is one who is able to make choices to use her time and resources in ways that she values. And I think we need to be supporting the choices that women make, and supporting women to make those choices that they feel that is important to them. At a philosophical level, I guess that's where I'd start. I think one of the challenges I have with the language of women's economic empowerment is it suggests that the problem is the woman, and I think very often the problem is not that. It is around a whole host of structural barriers which are impeding or constraining women from being able to act in ways that they would like to do, to access the education, to be able to use their time effectively. Those aren't problems for an individual woman that can be fixed by focusing on that woman. They are issues for the wider community and society. But I think maybe one of the things that I would say to the questioner in Honiara is that where a woman is able to make informed choices that she values about how to spend her time, and is able to control the results and the fruits of those efforts and put them towards purposes that she thinks matter, whatever those are, that for me looks like empowerment.
Amanda, how would you define an empowered woman?
Being able to buy the best fashion that she wants. Yeah, definitely being able to make decisions based on her own income. But the thing that we've seen is that women are spending money on their families, on, you know, the household and all that kind of thing. So I think it's also important that women are starting to maybe even take care of themselves a little bit too, because that personal happiness, it affects the whole family if you're satisfied, or, you know, you treat yourself every now and then, which we also do a bit of in the magazine. There's definitely people are calling it the growing middle class across the Pacific. And we're kind of, these kinds of conversations I think a little bit disregard that those members of society that are holding down full-time work, they've got a fortnightly salary, and they're, you know, in loving relationships, they have good families, they're putting their kids in private schools and things like that. And we can't disregard them. We're not saying that they're not Pacific Islanders. It's a different sort of section of the society. So empowerment, I think, definitely is being able to make those decisions for yourself, or even collectively with your partner equally as well, collectively equally.
We've got a question here from Timor Leste, but before that, is there a question in Sydney, ma'am?
How do you manage the cultural change when we're talking about men and women sharing household responsibilities, taking care of children, family, house responsibilities like that, changing the culture of men and their relationship with their career, and like minimizing the stigma from them going out of their careers to take care of children, which women always face. And so how do you go about managing that cultural shift onto men?
Cultures are dynamic things and they're changing all the time. I think, and I'm not trying to be glib by saying that there's no single answer, but we see it in our own lives, I think, where you're constantly having to negotiate who does what kind of work. I think you raise a really important question, which is that changing roles for women and changing roles for men can sometimes feel really, really threatening. I think part of the story is around not seeing power as a zero-sum game and really proactively engaging in conversations with men and women together around what the joint benefits are. In these resources and some work that we did at community level with University of Technology Sydney and some other work we've done with University of Western Sydney, it's very clear that men can be extremely supportive of increased and different roles, economic roles for men and women earning income, but that you have to engage proactively in that. People have to come along on a journey, and men can be extremely supportive of women, but we can't take that for granted. So I think engaging and working with men and women together and separately around the shared benefits of this. I'm not trying to be Pollyanna-ish, and I think sometimes power can be deeply resisted, but part of it is seeing, I think, that power isn't a zero-sum game, and that the communities and families as a whole can benefit. And we've seen ourselves really quite successful conversations around with men and women at community level in Solomon Islands around women's greater involvement in leadership and in managing natural resources. Leadership is better, family life is better. Men will often say when you're interviewing them about why they're violent, for example, it will be, we feel the pressure, we're the pressures of being the breadwinner, no one understands us. And so I think saying, actually, there's someone here who can share that breadwinning load, and it's your partner, but you need to be doing something else about some of the household and care work, because otherwise, the family time is going to be very constrained, and families can work out some really successful and productive arrangements. But those norms about what we expect of each other take time to change, and dialogue, I think, is a really important part of that. And those organisations like IWDA that are working at community level and at leadership level can be really supporting by providing safe spaces to have those conversations and resourcing and encouraging them.
Amy, can I ask you this question from Timor-Leste? What are your views on microfinance institutions that lend to women's groups and have very high interest rates? The loan usually ends up costing women's time and savings.
Well, I think that's of great concern, and I think that there has been models of microfinance and empowerment of women impacts that have been lauded for now a couple of decades in the aftermath of the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, and that success, and that was probably real success, and in various contexts it's been really successful, but you always have to look at the context and what it is that women are doing with the money they're getting, and how productively they're using it, and how they're paying it back, and what kind of impact it's having on their life as a whole, including psychologically, and the pressure that it can often put. So I think microfinance lending at usurious rates is a shame, and it shouldn't continue. That's not to say that women haven't benefited and there's not some good design and good models of doing microfinance. I think it does exist and it's possible, but it has to be absolutely grounded in the context in which they're lending, and needs to be, in a way that allows women to be successful with it, with the associated services and training and education that needs to go with it, and with, business models that make sense.
We've got a question here from Honiara. This one's directed at Joanne. There's a lot of interest in the issue of whether economically empowering women leads to lesser gender-based violence. Solomon Islands was one of the highest or has one of the highest incidences of gender-based violence in the world. Would the IWDA consider including Solomon Islands in this work?
Actually, the research that we're just getting off the ground next week actually is starting in the Solomon Islands. So I can tell the listener if they want to get in contact with me at IWDA, I can certainly put them in contact with the researchers who are starting fieldwork in Solomon Islands next week. We think it's a really important issue. We're not making judgments about whether the relationship between command over economic resources and violence against women is positive or negative. We want to hear those stories from women in different situations, from women at community level to market traders to employed women working in the professional sector in Honiara. And I think it's really important to understand from those women what strategies they're using, the ways in which access to income has been enabled them to make new choices in their lives, whether there have been any risks or not, how they've been managing that. But we know it's a really present issue for many women, and 64% I think of women will experience violence in their lifetime in Solomon. So that's close to 2/3 of all women. So we need to be factoring this in as a routine consideration when we're doing work that's around trying to improve women's economic choices. And we're really hopeful that the work that we do through this research will allow us to work with people who are providing financial services, microfinance, with international donors and others, to say, as you're doing this, these are some ways in which, and some practices which you can use to reduce the risk of violence. I think, as Amy was saying, I think earlier, that mobile phones and payment by mobile phones, removing cash from the equation, I think has got some real promise. But it's important to hear direct from women about the ways in which they're experiencing it and the sorts of strategies they're using. I think that's a first step for us, and we'll certainly be, I can assure the listener, we'll be in Honiara starting from next week.
Excellent. And we've got time for one last question, and this one's from Papua New Guinea to Amanda. Can you give an example of a successful Pacific woman who has emerged into the corporate world? What helped her get there? Apart from yourself, of course.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I'm not creating these people out of thin air. They actually exist. It's really exciting that we have so much material to work with, so many fantastic, inspiring people. Someone who made it really big. In our first issue, we in the magazine we also feature a senior role model, so somebody that's been through it all like us and got through on the other side and has been very successful. So I'd have to say Dame Meg Taylor. She's an amazing inspiration for women everywhere, not just in Papua New Guinea. But she's very just a go-getter. She's a lawyer, Papua New Guinea's first lawyer, female lawyer, sorry.
First ever.
Yes.
Harvard Law School.
Yeah, yeah. And at the moment she's up for a big position.
She is the she's the ombudsperson at the International Finance Corporation in Washington, D.C. She's retiring this August, but she's been the ombudsperson.
Yeah, she's
a
real. And I guess that her message is just to don't let anybody tell you can't do anything as well. So she's an inspiration for so many.
And someone like Alice Pollard in Solomon Islands, who was the first Solomon Islander to get a PhD and has been really working around developing financial literacy skills for women, and runs this amazing kind of mobile banking service where a little boat goes out to the remote Solomon Islands, and she's been putting her time into a small microfinance organisation, WARA, as well, that is enabling women who mainstream banks can't serve really because they're a long way out, 2 days little boat ride away. And so she's both achieved academically, but she's also running this small organisation that is enabling women to save and to mobilise their resources and to do things like invest in bringing solar lighting to a village that doesn't have electricity so kids can study. You were talking about the lack of electricity. So, Alice Pollard for me is another kind of, I'd hold her up as one of my Pacific heroes. I think she does amazing work.
Amy, can you think of anyone in your work?
Well, Lady Winifred Kemet, who is the patron for the Business Coalition for Women, also a lawyer in Port Moresby, who has been an outstanding role model and voice on all kinds of issues facing women in business, and particularly on violence. And she founded the Coalitions for Change, which is a domestic violence and organization, and she is our patron for the Business Coalition for Women. So she's quite extraordinary.
I'm glad we were able to end on a positive note. It's really good to hear that those stories are out there. But that does bring us to the end of our discussion. Can we please thank our esteemed panellists, Amy Luinstra, Amanda Donigi, and Joanne Crawford. I'd also like to thank everyone joining us here in Sydney and from afar. And remember, you can view this or any of our other Praxis discussions at our website, which is worldbank.org/praxis. Until next time, I'm Oscar Sabakti, and thanks for joining us.